Good morning. If you're just joining us, we'll get started here at the top of the hour when I'll hand over moderating and facilitation to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining the Northwest Community Forest Coalition Virtual Forum. We're really excited to have you here on day two. What we have in store for you is a really exciting panel on recreation. So without further ado, if you are just joining now, please mute your microphone and turn off your video. We'll have an opportunity later for you to share questions. Please share questions at any time in the chat box. And then later on, after the panel presentation, you may have the opportunity to unmute your mic and ask your questions live or contribute live. So thank you very much. If you're just joining us, please mute your microphone and turn off your video unless you're a panelist. Panelists and moderators, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to turn over meeting controls and exit the splash screen. Thank you so much.
Great. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm getting a thumbs up. So welcome everyone to a panel where we're going to be digging into some of the issues around recreation, forest management, and conservation on community forests, and looking at kind of the multitude of different values that you have to balance. And so for the panel today, I'm going to be joined by Jay McLaughlin, who at least on my screen is to my left, with Mount Adams Resource Stewards, Sean Chambers with Union County, and then Patrick Lucas, who I'm not seeing on here. Is Patrick on here? So we may have one panelist joining us midstream here, but we'll play that by ear and wing it a little bit, as is the way with COVID these days. So I'm going to start off by just giving a little bit of background, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jay and Sean to give a little bit of background on their projects. But to start off, kind of the larger question that we're asking and digging into is how, if you have a community forest, so you're past the acquisition phase, in terms of management planning and executing a management plan, do you balance the multitude of values that you might have? So for a number of the forests around, that includes active forest management, whether it's restoration oriented or oriented towards generating revenue to pay down the cost of acquisition. Most of the forests that we work on have some sort of recreational use that ranges from hiking to hunting to increasingly pressure for both motorized use and mountain biking. And so those are ones that we're going to dig into here. And then the final one is conservation. So how are you kind of protecting the conservation values if you acquired something directly for conservation values? How do you balance that with the other things you might want to achieve through the project? And kind of balance that out with the recreation and forest management. So that's the larger kind of narrative that we're going to be digging through. And I'm going to start off by handing it over. I think we're going to go with Sean first, and then Jay. And if Patrick joins us, we'll have him jump on at that point. We're just kind of giving us an introduction to yourself, some background on the lands that you work with, where it is, who owns it, what's the history of the ownership. And then we'll, from there, take a pause and go back to kind of what the uses and community connection is. So quick background, Sean Chambers is with Union County and Mount Emily Recreation Area. He has a forestry degree from Oregon State and has been with the county, I think, for about 10 years. So he's going to kick us off. And then Jay McLaughlin, I didn't even have to ask him for a bio at this point. I know him well enough. So he's a graduate of Whitman College and has a master's of forestry from Yale School of Forestry. He manages the Mount Adams Resource Stewards community forests and has played a key role in Northwest Community Forest Coalition. So it's great to have him on here. So I'm going to hand it over, Sean, I think, to you at this point, and then I'll keep an eye for if Patrick joins us and insert him at that point.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. Kind of gave my bio pretty short and sweet, but yeah, I've been here about 10 years and I came on at the beginning of this thing. It was acquired by the county. So I interjected shortly after a lot of the heavy lifting was done as far as the master planning. But so the history of the property, Mount Emily Recreation Area, locally we call that Mira. was purchased by Union County in November of 2008 for its recreational values and resource management opportunities. The acquisition was accomplished through a combination of grants from Oregon State Parks ATV grant program for $4.4 million, and then a matching grant from the Blue Mountain Habitat Restoration Grant Program for $250,000. So completely grant funded property acquisition by Union County. 3,669 acres. It's about 2 miles north of the city of La Grande. It extends from the low foothills adjacent to the Grand Ronde Valley here and upward to the steep slopes next to the west side of Mount Emily proper. The terrain's extremely varied, lowland meadows to rocky cliffs, some benches in there, but it's a mixture of rangeland and forest land with elevations from 2,900 feet up to 5,600 feet. Property's been managed for commercial timber production, kind of, you know, our recent history of a couple hundred years here. Commercial timber production and livestock grazing is an element of that. So Boise Cascade owned that for the majority of that time, and then sold it to Forest Capital in 2005, who then Forest Capital had evaluated the timber holding and it wasn't meeting their long-term objectives anymore. And so they were looking to sell. And so the community heard about this, and one of the scenarios was that the property could be subdivided into 15 residential properties. And then public access would surely be denied. Whereas historically, the property, the timber owners allowed our local community to use that property recreationally and used it for ATVing, motorcycle riding, hunting, all the things we use it for today. Snowmobiling, hunting, the berry collecting, mushroom hunting, biking, you know, that came online in the 80s. And then horseback riding is, you know, historically just a family activity around here as well. So in addition, there's an archery range on site. And then as you know, the county's taken over, the trail systems expanded dramatically, and those recreational opportunities have been greatly expanded. So, you know, ahead of that purchase, there was some controversy locally here on whether to make that purchase. And so they put it to a vote, and 62% of residents supported the acquisition. And so then the county negotiated with Forest Capital and pursued grant funding, as I laid out before. So that's kind of the big history of how we got to where we are. I don't know if that's kind of what I had in mind for you.
That's perfect. Yeah, great. So I'm going to take a pause here real quick because Patrick Lucas just joined us. So I'm going to insert him into the order and give a quick background. And I think, Patrick, you kind of understand the larger narrative of what we're working on with this panel. But the first question is sort of around the background of the properties you work with. So Sean just gave us the background for the Mount Emily Recreation Area in Eastern Oregon. And quick background on Patrick Lucas. So Patrick works in British Columbia with community planning, and particularly with First Nations and a little bit with community forests as well. And how we actually ran into him is a great article or essay that he wrote for Patagonia's Cleanest Line online blog about mountain biking and First Nations and equity issues and kind of engagement around uses of land. So that's where we wanted to pull him in. So Jay, if it's okay, I'm going to ask Patrick to go now, and then we'll kind of stick with this order of Sean, Patrick, Jay through the rest of the presentation, if that's all right.
Mute myself there. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Benjamin, and greetings, everyone, from British Columbia. So to give as Benjamin was saying, I think the reason he brought me on is he wanted to talk a little bit about the unique work that I do here in British Columbia. So I work with First Nations all over BC, and basically my role is acting as a liaison between First Nation communities and trail clubs and trail user groups that are looking to either set up or maintain trails for hiking, mountain biking, or other types of outdoor recreation. In BC, we have kind of a unique circumstance that affects land use. And some of the areas I do work in has community forests and some of it doesn't. So around 97% of BC is what's called Crown land, which is basically the province and the federal government asserting their title as having title over BC. And in a little bit of history of BC, I'm not going to try to go too far into this for you, but it's really important. When Canada was being established in the 1800s through a series of treaties that were negotiated between the federal government and First Nations across Canada, there were 11 treaties that were negotiated. And when they got to the Rocky Mountains, they basically just stopped and felt that they didn't have to negotiate any more treaties. And they left it that way for a little while. And then in around the 1850s, there was a number of major gold rushes that were happening in the BC interior. And there was concerns over American expansionism. And American miners were coming into BC and started setting up their own ad hoc governments and clashing with local First Nations. And the colonial government started getting really, really concerned. So they basically proclaimed all of what would become BC as part of the British colony under the auspices of the Doctrine of Discovery and the Royal Proclamation Act. And there was no treaties negotiated as part of that. They just declared it as part of the colony. It was a massive land grab that was for an area the size of much larger than most European nations. And it kind of stayed that way. And then the First Nations never conceded to that. And through a series of court cases leading up to as most recently as 2014, they were able to show that they never gave up the rights to their land. So most of BC, or all of BC, is literally legally unceded territory. And then in the 1990s, they restarted the modern treaty process. So we're actually undergoing the negotiation of new treaties, and it's a really complicated system that's become pretty much bogged down. So where clubs like mountain bike clubs and trail clubs find themselves is working within this very fraught environment where there's these competing claims over title. So what I try and do is I work with clubs and I work with First Nations to try and sort those issues out. And from my own philosophical standpoint is that this is Indigenous land, and we have to acknowledge that and work with it as best we can. And within that, there are a number of community forests that I work with who also have to deal within that complicated framework and build relationships with First Nations and try and find ways of moving forward towards reconciliation and acknowledging Indigenous rights and title, and not perpetuating that system of erasing Indigenous people and their rights from the land. And that's kind of the framework that I work in. So that's the 30,000 foot view. I think maybe as time goes on, we can get more into the details.
Perfect. That's great. Exactly what we're looking for to kind of frame things. So I'm going to hand it over to Jay now to give us a little perspective for most of us a little closer to home.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Ben. And actually, before I dive into my comments, I just wanted to thank Keola and Ben Dare for all their work organizing this gathering. And actually, Ben, happy birthday to you. I hear it's your special day. So really appreciate everything you guys did in pulling us together. Again, Jay McLaughlin, I direct Mount Adams Resource Stewards. We're based in the little town of Glenwood, Washington, which is about 45 minutes northeast of Hood River, Oregon. We are a community-based nonprofit organization. We're not actually a land trust, but we are focused on all things community forestry here in South Central Washington. And that involves some aspect of managing forests on a number of different ownerships, both federal, state, as well as private lands. Our federal work ranges from partnerships with the Forest Service and heavy involvement and fiscal sponsorship with our collaborative group, the partnerships with Washington Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, to private lands work that we do. But as a community-based nonprofit organization, we also own forest land, which is known as the Mount Adams Community Forest. And right now that totals 1,011 acres. I should just call it 1,000 acres, but every one of those acres has been hard earned, you might say. And those acres are spread out between 3 different blocks around a couple of unincorporated rural communities in our area. I already mentioned Glenwood. There's also the community of Trout Lake, Washington, to the west of us. And our first property was bought back in 2011. We've completed 5 separate purchases since then, including 2 this year. The properties had once been part of what was known as the Klickitat Tree Farm, which 25 years ago was over 100,000 acres. It was really highly regarded in forest industry circles and famous, at least from my perspective, for being part of, or being the subject of what was claimed to be the first sustained yield plan adopted in North America back in 1939. If you've ever heard me talk about this area before, I always say that, and I think most people think that may not be that significant, but it really is, in the sense that, you know, for 60, 70 years, there was a sense of high quality forest management, initially starting off as a lot of kind of selective timber harvest, uneven age management, as some folks called it, and it transitioned in the 70s and 80s to more even age management. But you know, kind of very reliable timber harvest that supported a local timber-based economy. And that really changed in the late 90s, early 2000s, as those lands sold to some other entities. So I call that out because that really drove our community coming together and our organization launching back in 2003, 2004 with the Mount Adams Community Forest Project is one of our great interests. I should also mention the Klickitat Canyon Community Forest Trust property, which is actually in between 2 of our community forest parcels. And that land is owned by the Washington Department of Natural Resources Community Forest Trust Program. Our organization had a major role in developing the management plan for that property. They had an advisory committee of 10 members, of which 5 were board members or staff of Mount Adams Resource Stewards. And coming out of that process, there was a recommendation that Mount Adams Resource Stewards be the implementing organization. That was over 2 years ago, and unfortunately, we haven't seen any progress on that project yet. And that's a 2,400 acre property, if I didn't mention that already. I'll focus most of my comments, though, throughout the rest of this morning on the Mount Adams Community Forest. And just a couple more things about that. You know, first and foremost, it's a working forest where we manage for forest health. That it's really what guides the decisions that we make, and for us that translates to silvicultural techniques that mimic our local understanding of disturbance ecology, where we rely on regular timber harvest to manage stand density and species composition and other considerations, as well as using prescribed fire to reduce fuels and develop kind of an overall fire adapted community strategy for these South Mount Adams communities. But the second biggest driver for our project, aside from that kind of, you know, sustainable forest management consideration, was public access. And my board chair, actually, after he retired from the Forest Service, took a job working for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's Hunter Access Program. And he would say that, you know, 15, 20 years ago, you could have walked from the eastern edge of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest all the way east to Highway 97, which as the crow flies is, you know, probably 50, 60 miles, Highway 97 being that north-south highway between Bend, Oregon and Yakima, Washington. But you could have walked entirely on private timberland that was open to the public. And you know, a lot of folks flocked to this area, and a lot of locals really enjoyed those lands for dispersed recreation, be it hunting, horseback riding, and things along those lines. And those are things that we've sought to maintain through the Community Forest Project. So it's not a real intensive recreational program, but it's something that definitely influenced what we tried to do. We have also constructed a 3-mile loop trail over the past year on one of our community forest parcels. And that's definitely something that caters to local folks before the snow's gone in the high country. It gets steady use. And maybe a useful aside to add to that is just how important trail construction has been for us, serving both as a community engagement kind of volunteer opportunity, as well as a place where we actually have an in-house stewardship crew that does a lot of fuels work and prescribed burn unit prep, and they're able to use trail construction as a fire line construction training tool. So I think that's been all I got for that question. Sorry, Ben, if I was too long-winded.
No, that's perfect. Great. And I think a lot of the point in this first bit was to kind of show the range of different approaches that exist out there and the range of different community forests, all the way from really large ones in British Columbia to fairly recreation focused to more conservation focused, where many folks in the land trust community are, to kind of active forest management and restoration set of goals and objectives. So yeah, that was a perfect set of introductions. So the second question is kind of trying to understand the current management structure. So each of these has a way that decisions are made. And I think that a useful piece of kind of setting the stage is to understand what those structures are. So who are the user groups and what are the primary user groups that you have represented in the management of the property? Is there a board? If so, who is on that board and how is that decided? How does the board make decisions? Those are kind of the next set of questions I'm hoping each panelist can dive into. So we'll, I think, go back to you, Sean, and then to Patrick, and end with Jay.
Sorry about that. Unmute there. For us, shortly after the acquisition, the county commissioners formed and appointed two advisory committees comprised of motorized users was one group, and then the other was a non-motorized advisory committee. And then resource-oriented management agencies, Department of Forestry and Wildlife, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, U.S. Forest Service. We have multiple general public positions on those committees. And then, you know, someone representing each user group, such as, you know, the motorcycles, ATVs, Jeeps, side-by-sides, grazing leasing position. And then the non-motorized would have the bicycle, hiker, equestrians, and Bowman archery ranges on the non-motorized side as well. So the advisory committees provide a public forum, and you know, just if action is needed on a specific item, they would make a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners. And then we'd take that decision or that recommendation to the Board of Commissioners, and they would make the final ruling and final decision on any action items that need to be taken there. So that's kind of the makeup. I am the acting land manager. I kind of carry out the processes of, you know, everything, getting the meetings established and carrying that forward to the commissioners, and, you know, coordinating with the volunteer user groups. And then, you know, to handle the forest management specifically, early in the beginning, we got a grant or a cash rebate through Department of Forestry, who had that to help develop a forest management plan. And so, you know, to play the, you know, the political game of how this really works is, we wanted that plan developed by someone credible. And so we reached out to Society of American Foresters, the Blue Mountains chapter here, and utilize their services of, you know, a group of locally well-respected foresters to develop that plan, and recognize that through Department of Forestry. And then, you know, took that to the advisory committee, got their approval and recommendation that the board adopt that. And so we did that. The commissioners adopted that. And so there's kind of a working plan that we have to utilize and something to fall back. You know, we have a document. So to implement that, myself, I'm not a real forester. So we brought on a forest consultant, a professional who knows this part of the world. And so he's been kind of implementing that plan. And so that's kind of what we've been working off and how we're making our way forward.
Great. So just to kind of summarize, it sounds like 2 advisory groups, they make recommendations to the county commissioners and the buck sort of stops with them. So they have the final executive power over anything that happens. You're in charge of implementation along with a management plan that was written early on and a consultant who does the like day-to-day oversight of harvest and whatnot. Does that line up?
Yeah, correct.
Perfect. Yeah. So I'm going to try to kind of summarize each one so we understand the differences, because I think we will see 3 dramatically different kind of structural systems. And it's going to be particularly interesting to hear from you, Patrick, given the multitude of different ownership types or management structures that you work with. So we'll hand it over to you.
Okay. So as I was saying before, I'm not directly involved in any particular community forest in BC. Where I do find myself involved is when I'm working with First Nations and clubs who are building trails or managing trail systems in community forests, which happens quite a bit throughout BC. And so when we're talking about the First Nations aspect, which is my specialty, what community forests have to do, depending on their age, because there's some community forests that are fairly old in BC. And when they were started, they may not have even considered or engaged with the local First Nations in any respect. So they're at a point where they have to deal with that legacy, and they have to find ways of engaging and bringing in the First Nations into that and dealing with that in their structure. Most community forests have representatives on their board of the local First Nations, which in some places can be one First Nation or it can be multiple First Nations. There'll be overlapping territories, and it can get quite complicated. And then typically they'll have, there'll be like a land manager, a forestry company that will kind of manage the community forest, and they'll be answerable to a board that will have representatives from the different groups that are involved in the forest. And that can be various trail user groups, First Nations, local community oriented groups that are involved, and they'll kind of manage the forest based on direction and guidance from those the people who sit on the board. And the First Nations are taking on a greater and greater role in that, and a larger say, as the forest will be within their territory, their area of responsibility. If there are new forests, or because we still have community forests that are being set up from time to time, they'll often engage with and develop a specific partnership agreement with the First Nation on whose territories they're operating, and they'll manage that together. So we have a whole bunch of different types of structures that are happening around the province, and First Nations are taking on a larger and larger role. And in a few places, First Nations have their own tenures and manage their own forestry areas. So it's not really a community forest in the traditional sense, but they'll run it for their nation and for their people. So in that sense, it is a community forest, but it's very much theirs. And they'll engage in anything from industrial scale and forestry to very much conservation oriented practices, or anything in between. It really depends on where they want things to go. Some of the largest exporters in BC to Asian markets are First Nations. So they'll have very widely different goals and objectives for their forest. So it can be really quite complicated. But if you get down into each individual community forest, it's probably very similar to what was just being described. It'll be a board represented by various different user groups, and then a land manager that is responsible for enacting those policies on the ground. So.
And just a quick follow-up question, Patrick, in terms of First Nations engagement, you mentioned that a lot of times there's like a cooperative agreement there in place between the First Nations and the community forest. Are there cases in terms of like them being a very important stakeholder where they're actually have seats on that community forest board, even though the community forest is not run by the First Nations?
Yeah, absolutely. My understanding is that most community forests would, in recent years, have either opened up positions to that and have been trying to, bring local First Nations onto the board, which can be challenging in and of its own right. I meet community forest associations that often ask me, it's like, how can we get a representative? Like, we've left this seat open and we're not able to get someone from the community, and there could be a lot of history there, and it can be very difficult to overcome those challenges. How do you get a local representative to feel comfortable coming and meeting and being in the position where they're supposed to represent their entire community? And it can be quite fraught. So we'll have those types of circumstances, but traditionally and historically, First Nations have always been really big actors in the BC forest industry. It's probably one of the key areas that they feel most comfortable in. So they play a big role in the management of those forests. For the most part, every area is a little bit different. It really depends on the history of the area, and it depends on what's happening with the local First Nation, but quite often they do sit on the boards.
Perfect. Great. So Jay, I'm going to hand it over to you to wrap up with how structurally decisions are made, how people are represented, all those things.
Yeah, no, we get calls sometimes on this topic, and I often describe it as if there were something like a spectrum of complexity and formality of structures that are used to make decisions on a community forest, we would be at that informal end of the spectrum and less complex end of the spectrum. For us, ultimately, the board of directors of Mount Adams Resource Stewards makes decisions about what happens on the community forest. And we really strive with the structure of our board to have a cross-section of both interests represented from the South Mount Adams communities, as well as some geographic representation. So, our board includes professional foresters, a former conservation district manager, a retired county judge, a business owner that was the former chair of the planning commission, ranching and environmental, and tribal representatives. Board members also come from five different communities in this area, and that's also been a focus of how we recruit and develop our board. That said, we really do make a concerted effort to get input from the broader community, and over the last few years, that has typically taken the form of an annual gathering. We've done it every summer until this summer. We typically hold a big pig roast, and we'll get over 100 people that will show up. Usually there's a lot of fun, food, beer, timber games. And before we let people leave, we inevitably conduct some kind of survey, and door prizes for people that get a ticket after they turn in their survey, kind of thing. And that's been really, really helpful for us, because we'll get over 100 people that'll show up for that. Whereas when we used to have kind of the drab evening presentation in the winter to invite the community out, we'd get, maybe 25, 30 people at tops. And so that's been a really good tool for us to get more information and insights from folks here in these communities. I guess the one other thing that we do is typically prior to a timber harvest, we'll lay out a portion of the unit and mark trees, and we'll invite the community out for a field trip. Interestingly, those typically don't get a ton of response. We'll get 7, 8, 10 folks, and I think part of that just stems from kind of the nature of our communities, in that they're very accustomed to timber harvest. A lot of the things we do actually are super visible and get a lot of positive response, but people don't feel super compelled to take time out to go to a meeting to actually look at which trees are marked or not. Is that help, Ben? I guess maybe the one other piece to the other add-on question you had was just, I'm a forester by training, and so I actually do a lot of that layout and tree marking, and that's kind of something that preserves my sanity from the other aspects of what it takes to run a nonprofit organization. We've actually this summer our organization grew to 16 staff by the time we brought seasonals on. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got a stewardship or fuels crew. We also have an invasive species management team. We've got a monitoring coordinator. So we've actually grown a lot in recent years, and we've had folks out there getting trained on the ground on how to do timber cruising and things like that that have been welcomed by those folks. So
That's perfect. Yeah. So it sounds like, though, in terms of if a decision's being made, you guys have a nonprofit board of directors that oversees everything that happens. And generally a decision would go directly to that board with recommendations from staff people. Is that right?
absolutely. Yep. And, as I mentioned earlier, these are unincorporated rural communities. We do touch base with county commissioners and, our local electeds, and they've been very supportive of the project, but typically we'll say, keep doing what's been happening on that land for, the past several decades. And that's about as much as they've wanted to get involved. So, but yeah, what you outlined there, Ben, is exactly the way it happens.
Perfect. So it sounds like, between the three, we have similar structures. They differ a little bit, but county commissioners, which basically serve as a board and get recommendations from 2 advisory groups, as well as professionals. Up in BC, a whole range of different ways that things happen, but generally with a community forest or any sort of lease tenure, there'll be some sort of decision-making group with stakeholder engagement, from what I'm hearing. And it sounds like their First Nations actually play a pretty significant role with a seat at the table on a lot of those boards. And then at Mount Adams, with a nonprofit board of directors that oversees both land management decisions with Jay and his staff's recommendations, and then also the actual land management itself. And I think in all 3 cases, the role of professional foresters, probably as a consultant for you, Sean, or Jay, with your personal mental health breaks, is an important aspect, it sounds like, of that. And then Patrick, with you serving as a consultant, it sounds like through a variety of capacities, but particularly through recreation planning and First Nations in BC. So I'm going to move to a third question, and we're going to try to open this up in the next 10 minutes for any questions that the audience has. So start thinking through questions you might have. If you want to put them in the chat, that's completely fine, or just hang on to them. And I think we'll have a way that folks can raise hands and we can call on people to ask questions. So start thinking about that. But the next piece I want to cover is describing some sort of management decision or conflict between user groups. So for instance, dirt bikers and mountain bikers not agreeing about a trail that they both want to use, and then you decide to do a big logging job that destroys their trail. Like, what happened? That's a hypothetical situation that hopefully has not happened. But that's an example. Up in BC, I'm particularly interested in recreational groups and First Nations, where maybe they didn't agree on recreational use or where that use was going. And then around Mount Adams region, I'm sure, Jay, there are a number of different stories that you can lean on of maybe some unintended uses as well. So both, what was that management decision or conflict, and why was it contentious or not contentious, and probably not easily resolved? And then how was it resolved, and kind of what did you learn from that process? So Sean, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm gonna go to something we're currently going through right now, is just some forest management, which we've been implementing some prescriptions, and we kind of strategically started on the motorized half of Mira. The western half of Mira above the rim is motorized, and then below the rim is the non-motorized, and that's area to mitigate some of the noise from the motorized, and it's closer to the homes and so forth. So anyhow, there's a very distinct difference in user groups and just philosophies and the way they perceive forest management. So, we've had years of successful operations on the motorized, not contentious. And so this year we look to move down to the non-motorized portion of the park. And we're looking at 200 acres to manage there, some commercial thinning and some pre-commercial thinning to follow that up. Basically for forest health and fire resilience. I mean, we're a perfect scenario of what's happening in the West here. So of what could happen. So anyhow, we put this together, kind of same process as before, put it through the advisory committee. In February, since that time, COVID's hit. Meetings have been difficult to carry out. And so the reality is we've just missed meetings. And in that time, there's been some tree marking of intended harvest, and some of those folks down there hiking, you know, they're not going by 50 miles an hour on a motorcycle. They're walking their favorite trail daily. And that paint is kind of a slap in the face for them without knowing much more than just seeing it there. So, and then that's kind of the source of the problem here is just lack of communication, and that's on me. There's no reason I can't communicate. I just haven't as well as I should have. And so in that meantime, the rumor mill has started and groups are forming how to stop this, and, you know, without taking the time to understand what's happening. So, you know, we're back on track, and, you know, the weather came around and we got out, like Jay has done, is get a field review opportunity, get the folks out there, and we had a great discussion, a great review, you know, explain to them the what and why of what's intended and what is planned to happen. And boy, just that little bit of education, people get what's happening. And by the end of that walkthrough, the group is encouraging us to harvest more. So just from that limited time of understanding root rot and mistletoe and you know, why we do what we do, it came full circle. It was kind of, you know, I don't know, it was funny and just encouraging for me that, you know, you don't have to be afraid of the pitchforks and all that. I mean, we're all people. I mean, the thing is, we're all very passionate and we care an awful lot. We just have a different little way of seeing it. So that's kind of where we're at. We're still working our way through that. But that was a good stroke on the part of the county in working with the public. So that's my little bit for you.
That's perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for. It sounds like also, though, you guys had come to a certain understanding of how things would operate based on working with the motorized advisory group and the recommendations they were making, and not having a problem with it, and then switching to how you interact with a different user group of particularly hikers and bikers. It sounds like maybe was more of an adjustment than you anticipated it might be.
Yeah, not a time to get complacent. So it was a good wake up for me, and I think we can be successful moving forward, but definitely a learning opportunity.
Great. So thanks, Sean. Patrick, on to you.
Okay. I think the example I'd like to share with you involves an area here in BC in the Southwest called the Sea to Sky Corridor. So it's a part of the province that runs from Vancouver north to Whistler. And I'm sure a number of you have heard about Whistler, you know, famous ski destination, mountain bike resort. And there was in the area, there are hundreds of kilometers of trail that receive hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Includes community forest, you know, crown land, quote unquote, crown land, unceded territory, as well as First Nations territory and their own timber tenures. And what had happened is, so the area had been growing incredibly popular for trails and for rock climbing particularly, and it had become a major destination. And what I want to highlight is how the different recreation groups reacted to a change in the land use. And what happened is, after 150 years of fighting to get land back, the Squamish First Nation received a bunch of parcels of land back into their jurisdiction under their authority through an exchange in exchange for the First Nation supporting a liquid natural gas development. So they got all this land that they had been fighting to get back. And as it would turn out, those parcels have a lot of very, very popular mountain bike trails and climbing areas, including one particular wall called the Petrifying Wall. It's a very, very famous climbing area that's been in tons of magazine pictures. And what was illuminating to me when this all happened, and it's ongoing right now, is the reaction of the different clubs. And the climbing community reacted, in my opinion, quite poorly. They got really upset, and they were saying, how could this happen? And it's so unfair. And if we had known about it, we would have lobbied to get those climbing areas, removed from that and put into a park. And they were quite upset about it. And the First Nation was basically saying, it's like, too bad. Like, we've been fighting for these lands for 60 years. You've never engaged or consulted with us. We're going to do what's important to us and for our people. Maybe we'll let you climb there. We'll see. Whereas when the media went to the mountain bike club and asked them, well, what do you think about this? All the mountain bike club would say is, we respect that this is their land. We're happy we get to share it with them, and we support them in what they do with their territory. And when I started, working with I was approached by the mountain bike club, because what they had been doing is, over the previous 15 years, they had seen that these types of changes were coming. They understood that they were working and playing in First Nations territory. They felt that the way the First Nation had been treated was unfair, and they wanted to do things differently. So over a period of 15 years, they had been engaging with the First Nation. They had been taking their youth out riding. They had been, whenever they wanted to get a trail built, they had already been engaging with the First Nation. Even though they didn't technically necessarily need to, they had gone to them for permission and been really proactive. So while the climbing groups were really upset, the mountain bike club was actually already developing a partnership agreement with the First Nation that would outline that they would manage the trails on their lands in their forest tenure areas, and it would manage how they could, build new trails or decommission trails, follow their Indigenous protocols, protect environmentally sensitive areas. So they had laid out all the groundwork that they needed to, and now they're going to be able to protect those trails. And the Squamish have every intention of doing forestry and continuing to work those lands, but they have such a solid relationship with the mountain bike club that there's a very good chance that a lot of those trails will be protected. And the climbing community, I think if they start engaging this in the right way, I think they'll be able to, maintain their access to those climbing spots. But for me, it was a really, really good example of the difference in the approach, because the mountain bike club took that long-term approach. They were respectful about it. They did it in a good way, which is something we say here a lot. We have to do things in a good way. They were able to protect those values. So for me, that was a very big eye-opening experience. And we see that throughout the province, in community forests, in unceded territory, those community groups that, build those long-term relationships. As I said, the mountain bike club worked on that for 15 years, and they maintained that consistently throughout of it. We're seeing that happen all over the province. And that's a big part of what I do, is I go around and I try to teach clubs that lesson, be like, you need to engage now. So the lesson we took from that is engage early, engage consistently, acknowledge that this is their rights and their title, and start working under that premise, and keep moving in that direction. And that's true in BC, but it's also increasingly true all across Canada, even within the treaty areas, that we have to engage in that way as best we can. Because across Canada, and I'm sure it's the same across the US, although differently, First Nations are becoming, they're asserting their claim to their lands. They're becoming a bigger part of the decision-making process, and we just can't ignore it anymore. And we can't cry foul when the situation changes, and pretend like we didn't know it was coming. So that's one of the most important lessons that came away from that.
Great. That's an awesome kind of set of pieces to consider, especially where the relationship is shifting in British Columbia, I think, faster than it is for most places in the Pacific Northwest. And so
yeah,
what I'm hearing is really, though, the proactive long-term relationship building, but also as a recreational user, not taking things for granted and not assuming that you have access to things, which is such an interesting counterpoint to what Jay was talking about, where you used to be able to walk across the whole Northwest on private timberland that was open for access. Yet now, if I want to just go across my road, I have to buy a key from Weyerhaeuser and pay them every single year. So a really different set of assumptions around what you should be able to access versus have a kind of responsible relationship with in terms of access. Great. So thank you, Patrick. Jay, I'm going to hand it over to you to wrap up the conflicts and disagreements section.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Something I neglected to mention before in terms of how we make decisions was a little bit about management planning. And actually back before we bought our first piece of community forest ground in 2009, I believe it was, we did have an ad hoc committee that was comprised of both board members and community members that developed this overarching forest management plan and vision for the community forest. And it came away with this vision statement that actually was pretty dry. But one of the things that always sticks in my mind from it is this idea of traditional uses or historic uses here for our community. And that really kind of permeates a lot of the things that we do. As I talked about earlier, cutting trees really isn't very controversial here, but a couple, 3 anecdotes come to mind when given your prompt, Ben. And one is a little bit more overarching, and that gets at that public access piece. One thing that happens typically now every fire season, usually kind of mid-July through a good chunk of September, is a lot of the private industrial lands closed down due to fire danger. And that's totally understandable, but where we're surrounded, at least with one of our blocks, and have private timber ground on other sides of our 2 other blocks, that has been something that those companies have approached us and said, hey, we'd like you to close down too. And we had to say, no, there were public funds that were used in acquiring these lands, and the community really rallied behind these acquisitions so that we could keep them open to the public. And closing forest lands for half of the summer is really not in the community's interest. So we can do this safely. We can do it without being a threat to your ownerships and your investments. And so we've kept those lands open, but that had initially created a little bit of a conflict, or just kind of different point of view between how we were approaching public access and how our neighbors were. Ultimately, we follow what the state and the Forest Service do. If it's an extreme fire emergency where they're closing public access to the Gifford Pinto National Forest, as happened 3 or 4 weeks ago, we go into a shutdown mode, but that is typically not every year. So that was one kind of bigger conflict. Another one that was, maybe it's a little bit silly, but several 4th of Julys ago, I was confronted on the main street of Glenwood as I was driving through. Somebody waved me down and was like, hey, what's your motorized policy on this 30-acre mill pond that happens to be on one of the community forest properties? And I was like, motorized access, what are we talking about? And he goes on to tell me about how he was out there paddling his canoe on the mill pond in the morning, and then another local resident who was testing out some mechanicking he'd done on his jet ski before he took it down to the Columbia River for the day, dropped his jet ski in and started roaring around the pond, and they about got into a fist fight over it. And so it was like, who would have ever thought that there'd be a jet ski on this little 30-acre mill pond? And so we brought it back to the board, and ultimately they're like, well, we said traditional uses. We don't think people have really had motorized use on that pond before, but I don't know, what do we do? And then the following Monday, I literally had this other community member walk through my door and pull out this old black and white photo of, back in the 60s or 70s when he's driving a snowmobile across the mill pond on water. And he's like, this looks like a traditional use to me. And I'm like, that might be a stretch, but we really didn't come to a good resolution on that one. It was a little bit of a challenge, but one of the things that we've tried to emphasize, especially at our annual meeting, is that we don't have a lot of acres. Like I said, a little over 1,000 acres, and we can't be all things to all people on every acre there. We really can't do a lot of things like a big kind of ORV motorized use type of program. We do allow that use on our existing 2 tracks, but ask people to stay on the developed roadway. One other little anecdote I'll mention that we're still grappling with was we did have a hunting conflict last year. There's one of our properties where a herd of elk tend to congregate every hunting season. And during last year's muzzleloader hunting season, there were a number of hunters that were all targeting the same herd, and it kind of became a local versus non-local thing. And again, it got a little heated, and people were knocking on our door. And so we were hoping to have it sorted out by this hunting season as to whether we would move to some kind of written permission hunt policy there. And we've yet to resolve that one, but it's tough when you have these relatively small ownerships and places where people can get concentrated and conflicts can emerge. Yeah, like I said, it's still in progress.
Great. Well, sounds like a complicated array of multiple uses, including muzzle loaders and snowmobiles on ponds. But again, kind of trying to factor in historic uses, and then also kind of it being a community resource, and that, like you said, it can't be everything to everybody. So given our timing, I'm going to wrap up with one very short final question, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. The final question is, if you had one piece of advice for other land managers, whether they're community forest managers, whether they're working with First Nations, or they're private land managers, confronting these topics of multiple uses on land, what would that piece of advice be? If you're going to give folks one piece of advice, what would that piece of advice be?
I'd say just be open to having conversations. Everybody's got a different perspective, and we all can learn something, good or bad. It will help you in the long run. So some of those you might hesitate to return that call or that email, but just do it, and you'll find that you'll probably both come away from it feeling better. And just having been heard or expressed yourself is a lot of what those are about. But some of those give me heartburn that I'm like, man, as soon as I'm done with it, I feel so much better, but I can let it grind on me for a couple days when I shouldn't. So as simple as that.
I think for myself, I would, expanding on what I was saying before about the big lesson that we took away, is with engaging with First Nations as soon as early as you can in any process, and making that a priority and being consistent with it. All too often, I think a lot of user groups, whether it's community forests or trail clubs, kind of take a transactional sort of approach to these things, and they go in, they create a partnership, and they think that's it, and you're done, and you can just kind of go on about it business as usual. It's all about, when you're working with First Nations, it's all about maintaining relationships. It's something that you have to consistently work at for years, and you have to make it a priority. And the other thing I'm always telling folks here is learn your history. I can't speak for obviously you folks down in Oregon or in the Pacific Northwest, but I'm always kind of astonished here in BC how little people know about the history of our province and how it relates to land use and First Nations. And I had a very good friend of mine, Adrian Alfonso, he's a Ojibwe from Manitoba, and he always said it's like we're all showing up to a trailhead together to go for a ride, and for First Nations, we have to feel like you guys are showing up without your shoes on and no gear. Like, you have to put in the work before you get here and understand the history of this place so that we can start at the same trailhead. So I think that's the really big message is things are changing. The days where we can just sort of brush that history aside and not worry about First Nations, is particularly here in BC, but I think it's happening across North America, as we have to engage in those issues. So engage early, be consistent, make it a priority.
Yeah, I guess for me, I mean, maybe it goes without being said, but one of the coolest things about community forests, from my perspective, is the opportunity to promote something that looks like participatory democracy, and really exposing folks in the community to the complexity of land management, and trade-offs with decisions. So I guess I would just say anything you can do to promote that sense of local ownership and decision making is, yesterday, Julie Renaud Evans, for those of you that heard the presentation on community engagement, really talked about that local control piece. I don't know, to me, I just think it's empowering, it's challenging, but it's so worth it in the end. I think it's what our communities and our regions and our countries really need right now. And so it's I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. Well, those are great set of things to wrap up with. And I think we do have a couple minutes. I'm getting a chat here. Somebody from Sustainable Northwest is saying, heat up your thinking cap and send your questions via the chat box. So we have a couple more minutes if folks have questions for our panelists. We may have lost everyone to Zoom fatigue already at just 10 a.m. in the morning. So.
And if people are expecting something totally different, don't hesitate to come at us with a question that we might not have touched on topically so far.
So we'll leave it open for a minute or two, but I just want to thank everyone, and particularly Sustainable Northwest, for helping to put this together. That I know that it's challenging to do a conference like this in a year of COVID. So thank you guys for sticking with it. And then also, it's given us a nice opportunity to have Patrick from BC and Sean from Eastern Oregon join us. But we do have a couple questions here. So I'm going to start off for trailheads. Who monitors parking, trash, and good behavior? And maybe each of you guys could take a swing at that. Sean, why don't you start off on that? Because you guys probably have the most trailheads.
Yeah, that's basically my duty. Something I'm adamant about, keeping that trash picked up. If they see it, they're more inclined to throw it out, but that's me. What were we monitoring? Trash and parking. Yeah, basically me. I do bring on a seasonal, but yeah, it's just keep after it.
Here in BC, I think to a large degree, the things like trash and trail monitoring is done by the user groups that have an agreement with the community forest to build and maintain the trails in the area. So they'll play a really big role in that. And it's a key part of maintaining access and showing that the user group can be a responsible user. So they often take that really, really seriously.
And I just add that from my perspective, the ideal is that a community forest project promotes that local sense of ownership and pride, and folks will start to see things like that and say, wow, this, we own this. That's something we don't want to see. And they pick up the trash. And we've seen that a little bit. I mean, I'd like to see it go farther, but I've certainly had calls from a group of women that walks on the trail a lot of weekday mornings, and had calls from them when they see trash. And there is a distinction between how you see, we're already starting to see, between how people see things like trash on a community forest property versus property owned by other folks. Some good questions coming in.
Sorry, and I'm muted. It is an interesting one where we see a range from somebody having a legal responsibility versus user groups. And increasingly, I think the trend is towards user groups playing that role. So the next one is Phil Chick from Arch Cape Water District. He's asking what tools you recommend to use when having an advisory committee create a multi-use plan. For example, hunting is a polarizing use. How do you determine whether that will be permitted or not? And Sean, I'm particularly interested for you guys, how you have approached hunting.
Being public ground, it's part of our agreement that would be hunting access would be maintained. That's part of the habitat restoration grant. And our partner with Department of Fish and Wildlife, they sit on our board. And so part of that master planning process, that upfront planning is imperative, got to do it. But that was all set out and laid out ahead of my coming here. And then, those questions kind of fall back on Department of Fish and Wildlife at this point.
And have there been conflicts around hunting on there?
Not a lot. It's the target shooting, which we don't allow. That's typically, what we do hear about. There is concern. It is an interesting mix of recreation and hunting. The potential is there, but that's such a deeply ingrained historical use here, and part of everybody's recreation and family life. So it's kind of our part of the world. It's interesting that way, but that's how we're approaching it for now.
Jay or Patrick, do you guys want to add anything to that in terms of tools or toolkits for multi-use plan and then hunting as a particular issue?
I don't think I have any specific tools, but I think one of the things I would really echo is what Sean was saying is really strong engagement with all the stakeholders ahead of time and setting out what those values and priorities are going to be, and making sure everybody has a chance to have their voices heard in that process, because that's where you're going to get that sense of ownership, that sense of buy-in. So that engagement and planning is going to be really important. And I think you do need to consider those traditional uses. I know community forests here have really run into a lot of conflicts when they've tried to exclude groups that have been there for a long time. And it doesn't really work. You really have to engage everybody as part of the process. And I think that's going to be absolutely critical if you're setting up a new community forest or dealing with issues as they're ongoing.
Yeah, Ben, I don't know that I have a lot to add. Yeah, for us, in super rural area, hunting's a part of the culture, part of the tradition. As I described earlier, we've got some complexities to deal with in terms of the concentrated use aspect of things. But other than that, kind of a no-brainer for us. And I think a lot of folks, I mean, as these communities change a little bit demographically, we might see some different perspectives on things like hunting. But I think also folks, when they move to a rural community like this, recognize that that happens every hunting season. You see a lot of folks rolling around in orange vests and with guns in the gun rack and that kind of thing. So, I was involved at the very, very beginning of a management planning process for a property that was like a community forest to the east of us, actually owned in part by the conservation district over there. And there were really interesting conversations that were emerging at the onset relative to tribal use with the Yakama Nation and local folks. So the idea was that the property was gated, but some of the tribal members, I think, were interested in having a key to that gate so that they could do things like gathering of some of their traditional foods. And then the question expanded to like, okay, well, would that include hunting if tribal members are, in the spring, maybe they're gathering roots, but in the fall, would they be able to drive up the road that non-tribal members are having to hike behind? And what kinds of conflicts would that create in terms of a guy who's just huffed and puffed a couple miles behind a green gate, and all of a sudden here comes a tribal member rolling down the road in a pickup and jumps out and shoots the same animal he was pursuing. Those kinds of situations, and unfortunately, I think some of that conversation got pretty non-productive, and I don't know where it stands at this point.
Great, that's a perfect set of answers. And all I can add is, Phil, I don't envy you because I think there are a number of trophy bulls walking around behind the gates right up behind your water plant. And this actually leads us right into the next question. So Sally Bernstein from Sustainable Northwest had a question that came to Sustainable Northwest this morning. They're contemplating a community forest plan for an area that is critical to water supply, so probably municipal drinking watershed. One of the fears of allowing public access is that irresponsible people could increase the chances of fire. Neighbors to this area also do not want the increased traffic from public access. How do you suggest these issues be addressed? And I can address this a little bit. I didn't actually never introduce myself. I have a company, Springboard Forestry. I work as a consulting forester, and a lot of my business is managing municipal drinking watersheds. And across the board, the majority are closed in the Northwest to public access completely. So Bull Run and Cedar River are probably the most famous of those, as Portland and Seattle's watersheds. And both of them went from places that had some level of public access to completely closed to public access. And others are similar to that. City of Astoria is a good example of one that is completely closed to public access. It did have historical uses, but based on we think about uses as intended uses versus unintended uses. And the amount of unintended use as a result of hunting in particular caused the city government to actually close the property completely. And it has not been a huge issue because it is a fairly remote property and it was creating a lot of traffic on roads past other houses. So that is a complicated one, but also I think municipal drinking water is different enough from kind of a multi-use resource that protecting drinking water is something folks can generally come to more agreement around, and professional planners and foresters have a much greater role in that decision-making process than kind of the examples we've been talking about where you have an advisory group or a board. But if anyone else has anything to add in terms of a critical water supply and access or use, I'm all ears.
I heard the concern about fire is one that I hear as well. You know, well, you're going to set our property on fire and so forth. That just reinforces the need for sound forest management. You know, and that's that education piece where some people think just leave it alone and everything will work out. Well, we've been in the forest. We've started managing that forest for better or worse. And in my case, there's a lot of cleanup to do. They did not leave a healthy forest after the years of utilizing that resource. So we certainly have to manage that and clean it up and get it back online to a healthy state that could handle a forest fire. That will happen. Hopefully not while I'm here, but it's going to happen. So that was the one piece that I clued into there.
Yeah.
I think jumping in there for here in BC, we have kind of there's a mix of where some watersheds have been completely shut off to the public. And we have other areas that have actually fairly extensive use, including right here in my own backyard in the Comox Valley, where a local trail system gets somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 visitors a year. And it is an area that's a part of the drinking watershed. And in that sense, the community has kept it open, but there's a long history of the use, and there's a lot of confidence around people acting and behaving appropriately. And a big part of it is that they see the trail community, so the mountain bikers and trail runners and hikers are part of keeping eyes on the ground and monitoring the land and making sure that people aren't camping in a rogue kind of way. And that does happen throughout the valley. So they're basically using those communities to enforce and monitor for things like fire and those types of hazards. So it can be used as a way to deal with those issues. And First Nations in particular, when I'm working with them, have used that. As many First Nation communities, when I first start working with them, their biggest fear is that putting trails on their lands can just attract more people. And they have a history of their reserves literally being used as dumps, like people dump garbage on, hidden parts of their reserve. And what we found, and what we end up kind of using the trails is saying, like, well, once you have people using the trails, they have a lot of incentive to keep those trails clean and keep them safe. And now you also have eyes on the land, because people are dumping and camping and starting fires where there's no one around to watch what's going on. So it's become a part of the guardians on the land process here at BC. And we actually train up Indigenous youth to be land guardians, and they get jobs to mountain bike around their territories for the summer and take part of that. So you can use the trails to actually protect the land, but it really depends on the place. It depends on the history of that use and how confident the community feels around that.
Great. Jay, do you have anything you want to add, or should we jump to the next?
I'm good for jumping to the next one.
Okay, so we have two that I'm gonna, given that we only have about 5 more minutes, skip over. So one is about generating excitement for protecting a watershed and viewshed in a retirement community, and how do you kind of build that interest. And the next one is about legal structures for ownership, so government, nonprofit, or LLC. Both of those are ones where I would urge you to reach out to the staff at Sustainable Northwest and visit the Northwest Community Forest Coalition website, where there are a bunch of resources related to those two questions that I think are a little bit outside of kind of what we have time for today. But I do want to end with 2 questions that came in from Lynn Shorn and Carrie in the chat here. What communication tools do you all use for community input? We have many social media avenues and different voices that you can use to get things out there. Do you post information for input at trailheads? I'll let you guys go in whatever order makes most sense. So just jump in.
Sorry, I'll jump out here. We don't at trailheads, but that's currently on our agenda with our advisory committee. The local bike club is very ambitious, which I think that's consistent around the world. So they're interested in getting more monitoring done and some of those things. And then I'm not up with the time, so I'm just getting a Facebook online, and we got a website, and I encourage email, and I leave my phone number everywhere. So I mean, that's call me, talk to me is my preference, but I'm trying to get up with speed here of the times personally.
Jay, what do you guys do signage, or I know you guys have a news.
Yeah, I get we do a lot of things not really well, in terms of a little bit of signage, a little bit of social media. We have the annual gathering that I mentioned earlier, trying to be out there present, I think, as Sean's described, in terms of, making sure we're driving through the properties once a week at least, especially during times like hunting season when more people are using them, and just stopping in and talking with folks. I would say that those are kind of our primary ways by which we engage folks.
And Patrick, what do you guys see up in BC? I assume there's a wide range from some that do zero communication to some that are very engaged.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ones that are successful at it use a multitude of tools. So you have folks who use Facebook and Twitter quite consistently. They have active websites where there's regular updates. The Cumberland Forest here in the Comox Valley is very good at that. Information at trailheads, but they also do consistent community engagement sessions. I'm always seeing here in my own community with the Cumberland Forest, I'm consistently seeing postings about it, and I've managed to make it out to a couple meetings. So they're really proactive and engaged that way. And I think there's a number of community forests where, because they're more remote and they don't have as many stakeholders, they don't have to be as concerned about that. So they have less incentive or motivation to do that. But the ones that are successful use every tool that they can.
I would just urge people, in terms of the active forestry and mountain biking, Central Oregon Trails Alliance out of Bend has done a bunch of work around how do you communicate forest management to recreational user groups. And they got themselves in fairly hot water a couple of years ago through some trail work and forest work that was not very well advertised. And now they have really well done reader boards at the trailheads explaining the silvicultural treatments, walking through the reasoning. And I think that they'd probably be open to sharing kind of how they've done that. So it's one that I was particularly impressed by, because you're riding past a lot of orange and blue paint. And I think it was spurring some of the things that Sean has talked about in terms of a kind of backlash response of, you're not going to cut down all those trees, are you? I think another one that's very minor is whether it's leave tree marking or take tree marking is often not communicated in materials. And that's something where people don't understand whether trees that are painted are going to be left or if they're going to be cut down. And the assumption is paint is a bad thing. So another thing to think about. So in our last 4 minutes, I want to finish with one question here. Any thoughts on how much weight, trails, capacity, etc., to give smaller user groups versus large? Or ideas on decision-making frameworks? For example, a relatively small portion of the community wants horseback riding opportunities, where more folks want hiking opportunities. Who gets to be considered a stakeholder and have a voice at the table? In some ways, managing for horses will benefit very few individuals, but excluding horse use also excludes a portion of the community. And Sean, maybe we'll start with you, because it sounds like something that you guys have probably dealt with quite a bit.
Absolutely. No, that's something we kind of hang our hat on, is that we're a true multi-use recreation area. So on the non-motorized, it's equestrian to bicycles to hikers. And so back to setting the stage in the very beginning of expectations and how this is going to play out. That's something that I've had to stand by, because, every group can be, not to put a negative stereotype, but a little bit manipulative to get what they want, and they'll push people down to get what they want. So that master plan has kept me on the straight path, but at the same time, I see the progression of mountain biking and their need to have their own trails. So I get that, but and that's just being upfront. Don't, say we're going to build this trail together and then in 2 years say you want it just for the bikes. That's not going to work. I think if you want to take that next step, be upfront and say, okay, here's what's in place. Can we take that next step? And I think most land managers would be open to that, you know? So that's kind of where we're at, but we've definitely had that fight. And, you know, to this point, everybody, we're sharing, and we're hoping to be that example of that working, but it's always a challenge, always being contested, so.
Yeah, I think I would really echo what Sean was saying there. I think the biggest challenges that we're seeing here in BC is the changing nature of the types of recreation that people are engaging in. There's still a very large and active equestrian community in BC, though it's either plateaued or it's decreasing pretty much across BC, whereas mountain biking is exploding and has been for the last few years. And it's dealing with that change has really been the most challenging piece. And that's where community forests and the government here in BC in dealing with that Crown unceded territories has been not doing a great job of facilitating that conversation. And it's been like the trail user groups, the Outdoor Recreation Council, which is a provincial wide body that realized it was an issue and started engaging in it and getting that conversation going. And another big piece that we're dealing with here is e-bikes, which I'm sure you're going to be dealing with down there, is how do we deal with that change? Because it's coming, whether we like it or not. And one of the challenges with the mountain bike community is if they're not satisfied and dealt with and educated about what they're going to be allowed access to and buy into that, they go out and they build rogue trails, which is causing a huge problem here in BC. With the Cumberland Forest here in my own backyard, rogue builders have been undermining a very fragile agreement between the forestry company and the mountain bike community, to the point where the forestry company is threatening to cut off access. So it's not so much like getting that agreement that will last forever. It's about how do you develop a system that can deal with change over time. And that's going to be the critical piece, because I suspect that recreation, we've been watching it change a lot in the last couple of decades. I have a feeling that's going to even change faster in the next 10 years, next 15 years. So we have to be ready to deal with that change.
And I'll just add a couple of things. I mean, one, there's a pretty amazing example down in Hood River County, Oregon, where they have world-class mountain bike trails, as well as a major timber program on county forests that supplies something like a quarter or a third of the county budget. And so there's kind of that constant tension there between recreation and timber harvest that, for folks that are really interested in that, you might look into. I mean, they're a strapped department there in terms of staff and a lot of things that they've got going on. And so sometimes it's hard to get airtime with them, but worth checking in if you can, or if you're interested. And I guess just the other thing I would mention is I don't know, I guess in terms of this specific example with horseback riding versus hiking trails, I don't know if they necessarily are mutually exclusive. And in fact, I mean, we had those conversations here on our forest where backcountry horsemen, we had a board member who was really into backcountry horsemen, and they're a group in our area that does a ton, whether it's helping with trail maintenance or whether it's packing fish into high mountain lakes for stocking, or and so, you know, figuring out how you can build those partnerships and alliances that can benefit both user groups, I think is really important. Nothing new, I know, in terms of what we're saying here, but for me, I guess at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to, like, how do you define that community forest? And community forests in some of our communities are really a response to other ownerships, you know, federal, state, where they may feel like they don't have much of a voice in terms of, you know, user, or I guess decisions that influence what they're able to do, how they're able to use those lands. And these community forest lands are a place where, again, going back to that participatory democracy piece, they can engage, they can feel like their voice is heard, and a lot of the times they can work with their neighbors and they can come up with something that's win-win. So that's what I'd encourage.
Great. So I think we're not just out of time, but a little bit over time. So I just want to thank again, Sean, Patrick, and Jay. This is a great panel, and you guys' willingness to dive into complex topics and kind of have a no BS approach to the challenges of these issues has been really appreciated by me. And then also a big thank you to Keola and Ben Dare from Sustainable Northwest. And it sounds like happy birthday to Ben Dare as well. That much appreciated of forging forward with the Community Forest Forum despite having to move it online. So thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day. Don't get Zoom fatigue. Go for a walk or something. And thanks again.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, great presentations.
Thanks, Ben. Good put together.